As someone who was a city official for such a long time, how difficult is this to drive through something like defunding the police or cutting funds? Has a lot changed since you were in office, and probably talking about the issue of policing in some version of or another?
Well, this is a lot. This whole issue is about more than the budget of the police department or even the use of force tactics which are permitted. In 1982, we banned the chokehold in LAPD. Yet we've had problems in the last almost 40 years, even though we banned it. There were strict regulations on the use of a service revolver, the police officer's gun, yet we have problems with the officer-involved shootings. It's much more than just one tactic or one piece of legislation or one budgetary appropriation. It's a whole culture that needs to be changed, and that doesn't happen overnight. And I know it's frustrating to most folks. It's frustrating to me. But there's an opportunity now because it was very difficult to reform the police department 25 years or 40 years ago. There was no constituency for it. I shouldn't say no, but there was no broad constituency for it in the city of Los Angeles. But today, yesterday, there were 50,000 people on the streets of Hollywood. That's a huge demonstration. I can't count on one hand the number of demonstrations that have been that large in Los Angeles, and it's multiracial, it's multi-ethnic, it's multicultural, it's multi-generational, and that to me, as an ex-politician, those are votes. So those who want to advocate for reform now have a political force giving them ballast to make those changes. And I think you're seeing that across the country. It's not unique to Los Angeles. You're seeing it in Minneapolis, in Indianapolis, in Baltimore, in Washington, and New York. And so it's going to cause some rethinking. I wish they hadn't used the word defund the police or end the police department. That's not going to happen, and it creates all kinds of other images. But what I think the bulk of the people marching on the streets and the reformers, the advocates for reform, are looking for is transformational change, cultural change, corporate cultural organizational change in a department that really hasn't fundamentally changed since 100 years ago. It's an imperative, and I think this movement that has developed gives elected officials, policymakers, police commissioners across the country the raison d'etre to actually develop ideas for reform and then implement them, not just have a study and have it sit on the shelf.
Right, and to your point about using the term defunding police, for sure there is a group that uses it, but then when the rest of us kind of run with it and use it, in context that isn't exactly about defunding the police altogether. So just to make that point clear, as a politician, it's always interesting to me, or someone who was in politics, it's always interesting to me how much pressure does a politician have to have from the people in order to feel like they have the will to do something drastic or transformative, as you called it.
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. It's not a science. Every politician has a constituency, and he has to measure how far he or she is going to get out there before he's a leader, a loner. Everybody wants to lead, but if you go out too far, you lose your following. You've got to bring people along with you. So that's one criteria for how far a politician's willing to go. And of course, the first thing that a politician, at least I speak for myself, the first thing that I would look to when I made a decision on reform or on any issue is, do I believe in it? Do I support it? Do I want to do this? Is it the right thing to do? And then calculate the political, pros and cons and what kinds of coalitions do you need to build to do it. When it comes to police reform, up until recently, there wasn't a broad-based political constituency that you could see that actually would go out and march on the streets in every part of the city. So you've had demonstrations in the San Fernando Valley, in Hollywood, in San Pedro, in South LA, and East LA, and it's been a broad-based coalition. And I think politicians take note of that, and can sense from that people are thirsting for change, and they're willing to spend their own time and inconvenience themselves to go out and march and stand in front of a line of police officers and call for what they want to call for. It's a message to politicians that there is support for this. So you have different kinds of political figures in City Hall. You've got those who have been calling for reform of the police department for a long time. You've got those who never spoke up on the issue because it was not politically convenient for them. You've got those who've been on the fence. So I think what you're seeing now is that those who are on the fence have gone over to the reform side. And those who never spoke up are starting to speak up. I mean, who thought Mitt Romney would march with Black Lives Matter in Washington? Did. So, I mean, it's now the question is, can this be sustained? I have a feeling, and it's just a feeling, that this is not going to be one of those cases, as we've seen in gun legislation after the massacres in our schools, which, after a couple of weeks, it just fades into the background. This isn't going to fade into the background. This is going to leave a lasting impression socially, culturally, politically, in every which way across this nation. And I think, and we have a presidential election in 6 months, or less than 6 months, 5 months. And that's, that plays a role in all of this. So I hope that all of the energy that has been exhibited will also be exhibited come November when we select our next president.
Yeah, those are all very good questions. There's just so much going on in the political space. I mean, there usually is, but especially now. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us, Professor.